Hello everybody, welcome to Kinokuniya Bookstores this evening. It's great to see you. We have a really special treat for you tonight. I'm in the middle of reading Infomocracy, which is a Locus Award finalist for the best first novel, and the book the Huffington Post called one of the greatest literary debuts in recent history. And for a first novel, I'm saying it's incredible to read. Malka is the author of the Sentinel series, which includes Infomocracy, and tonight's talk, Null States. Malka is a writer, humanitarian worker, PhD candidate at the Center of Sociology of Organizations, that's in French, I'm reading it as best I can in English, studying governance and disasters. She's named Senior Fellow for Technology and Risk at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs for 2015. She has more than 8 years of experience in humanitarian aid and development and has responded to complex emergencies and natural disasters in Uganda, Darfur, Indonesia, Japan, and Mali. So her background in governance and humanitarian affairs has made these novels very realistic. It's a great read. So let me say no more and introduce Malka. Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks. And thank you all so much for coming. I'm really excited to be here because, as I was telling him, I love Kinokuniya. It has been my lifeline of English books in more than one place in the world, and they also just have such great stuff. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to read a selection from Null States, and then I'll talk a little bit about what this book is about, and then I'll take some questions. And I'll probably be interrupted at some point by an inflatable flamingo. A huge tree branches high over the entrance to the compound. The shade would be welcome because even in the rainy season, the daytime temperatures are over 43 degrees Celsius. But a flock of large white birds is draped over it. Roz has to hope she'll get used to the smell, but getting in and out of the compound is always going to be a literal crapshoot. Information, projecting annotations and explanations over her vision, can tell her that the tree is an Acacia auriculiformis and that the birds are Ciconia ciconia. But Roz doesn't find out why they don't get rid of the birds until Amran's briefing. It's the first topic she covers, before the logistics of their meeting with the head of state or even the security guidelines. The birds weren't there when I signed the rental contract 3 months ago, Amran tells them, in a tone that says the calling has already frayed her nerves. The owner of the compound, Halima, is pregnant, and it would be bad luck to disturb the birds and worse luck to cut down the tree. From the sound of it, Amran has mooted both possibilities. Roz isn't going to judge her. Amran is the information field lead for the Sentinel and will be here for years, while she and the rest of the SWAT team are only in CAS for the week, maybe 2. She's more interested in the problem of how difficult it would have been to get that story from information. Without the inside knowledge about the pregnancy, you could ask about birds and trees all you liked without getting anywhere near the explanation. Roz starts doodling an algorithm. According to information, the birds are seasonal migrants, Minja puts in hopefully. Halima says they will leave after the rainy season, Amran says, but she doesn't sound cheered. Roz switches on visuals of the local weather forecasts. This week, sunny, 47.8, sunny, 47.2, sunny, 46.1, sunny, 48.3, sunny, 48.2, sunny, 46.7. She flips further ahead. Sunny, sunny, sunny. Having explained the smell, Amran is getting into the protein of her presentation with a 3-dimensional headshot of a thin, neatly bearded man with a wide smile and twinkling eyes rotating in the center of the room. A personal history tracks down the side of the image. Abu Bakr Ahmed Yagoub, known by the identifier Al-Jabali because he was born in the Jabal refugee camp in what was then eastern Chad. And he became Sentinel governor here? Charles's interjection is more disbelief than question, but Amran answers it anyway. He moved here 10 years ago and was one of the key activists pushing for the adoption of micro-democracy. Although, of course, it didn't happen until the Sudanese state had collapsed from within, Al-Jabali is credited with laying the groundwork for a smooth transition and leveraging that into political success, both as Sentinel governor here and as head of state for the whole Darfur government. Amran throws up a large projection of the area previously known as Darfur, now divided into 78 sentinels of 100,000 people each. Each is empowered to choose its own government from among the over 2,000 worldwide, but in this isolated region, most of them have stayed local. 30 of those sentinels are held by the Darfur government, led by Al-Jabali. It's a strong showing for a government competing in its first election, but Al-Jabali doesn't seem satisfied. The government's policy papers and rhetoric are rigorously, even stridently pacifist, but there have been troubling occurrences of nationalist talk and hints at expansionism. The most disturbing incident occurred a few weeks ago when 19 Darfuri citizens staged a rally in a sentinel belonging to 888, a corporate government that originated in China. This is not a particularly sexy assignment. No knife-wielding fanatics ranting about the people they hate just across the sentinel line, no dicey border with redrawings. But Roz can feel a jitter of excitement in the team anyway. For the past year and a half, SWAT agents, the elite of information's global bureaucracy, have been cleaning up the mess left by the last election. Confusion, sabotage, recounts, and fraud sparked low-level conflicts in more than 100 sentinels worldwide. The first urgent missions put SWAT agents and security officers up close and in the faces of swindled voters to explain what happened and why they shouldn't take out their frustration on their rivals, the ones they thought they had vanquished politically. Progress was slow and irregular, but the work was never boring, and less than 2 years later, the handful of remaining battles have settled into a tense equilibrium. It isn't over, but this is their first job not directly related to the election fraud since it happened. Finally, they're back to classic SWAT work, a populace that, after a long history of propaganda exposure and conflict, is high risk for nationalism and other pathologies, and a charismatic new government that doesn't yet understand the extent to which information will call them on their exaggerations. It's tough when people who have been the losers for so long finally get their chance, only to find that the rules have changed, Maria comments. Roz is mildly surprised to hear that kind of empathy-based extrapolation from a pollster. Maria is the only member of the 4-person team Roz hasn't worked with before, and Roz hasn't had time yet to form an opinion of her. 10 years must seem like a long time to wait for the next chance to expand, Charles agrees. Round-headed and 40-something, he's the oldest team member and the one Roz has worked with the most. Solid, skilled at building rapport with local elites, and not in the least starry-eyed about information. She wonders if he's making his feelings known about the latest controversy in the upper reaches of the bureaucracy. The director level at Information is concerned enough about cynicism and disengagement, and about the competence of the new policy-first supermajority, that they're considering speeding up the election cycle, holding them every 5 years instead of every 10. For now, those discussions are both secret and hypothetical. Amran's presentation is over and they should get moving. For today, Roz begins, let's focus on building the relationship with Al-Jabali, seeing how he sees things. Reinforce election protocol in the background, but subtly, and listen for issues where we can work with Al-Jabali to make him, all of them, happy. She looks at Amran. Is it time for our meeting? Amran blinks, probably glancing at the time in her personal, eyeball-level projection. Yes, we should head over there. She's twisting her hands in the front of her long skirt. Actually, Al-Jabali may be a few minutes late. It seems he's traveling from another Darfur sentinel. Unusual to make an information team wait. Roz steels herself for an uncomfortable mission. The visit was planned before I gave him the SWAT team's schedule, Amran adds, but Roz is still skeptical. Can you confirm his ETA? Charles asks. They're sitting in a square brick room, one of 2 freestanding offices inside the compound. There's a wide-bladed fan shuffling air through the vent openings high in the walls, and the outside of the building is wrapped in heat reflectors, giving the interior the feel of a shaded courtyard. Even so, Roz can feel sweat dripping down her back. No one wants to stand out in the sun waiting for a dignitary any longer than necessary. Amran blinks rapidly, checking his location and trajectory on Information. 22 minutes, she says, but the rest of the government is already assembling at the arrival area, so we should go. They take the exit under the bird-filled tree like a gauntlet, one by one, dodging between the white splatters on the sandy ground. Outside the brick wall of the compound, the packed sand street runs straight between other similar walls, some of reed or sticks, others reaching the exalted level of concrete. A pair of children guiding a donkey with taps from a branch pass them at a cross street. There's little else to see, and everything is in shades of brown and beige. Information here is starved for complexity, for objects to identify and backstories to report on, and Roz gets a wealth of detail about everything she sees. The bricks were baked on the outskirts of town. The reeds are collected during the rainy season. The concrete comes in by truck over pitted dirt roads through the desert, their routes traced on maps that hover briefly before her eyes, 60% transparent. The children have no public information showing, but the donkey is a Rafawi. Despite the dullness of the colors and the scarcity of input, no pop-out advids even. The newness of it all sparkles for Roz. She always enjoys this time at the beginning of a deployment, when all the information is fresh and she can feel a composite understanding of the place building piece by piece in her mind. She finds herself walking next to Minja. "How does it feel to be home?" she asks. Minja knows this area better than any of them. He grew up in Nyala, the largest nearby city, in what is now a sentinel belonging to 888. "Pretty good, actually. It's been a while." He stretches his shoulders back and exhales as though the intense heat and the burning glare of sun-off sand are pleasant for him. All of them are wearing heat-reflective clothing except for Minja, who's wearing a flowing white jalabia. Roz is sweltering despite the climate control properties of her iridescent trousers, but Minja wears the thin cotton as though he belongs there. She doesn't even think he's sweating. "They almost didn't let me come, can you believe that?" "Why?" "Because of my mother. In the end, though, they decided it wouldn't be too much of a conflict." Roz has no idea what he's talking about, and glances down so she can check with information. If he sees the update flashing against her eye, he won't be offended. He gave her enough of a cue to search on without volunteering the intel himself, so looking it up is the most appropriate response. In the meantime, she keeps up the small talk. "I don't know. I feel like I get sent on every African mission they get, and where I'm from is nothing like this place. Culturally, climactically, ethnically." "I bet they've never sent you to your hometown though, right?" "True, but her home is a special case." She sees that Minja's mother is now the governor of the sentinel he grew up in. Roz can understand why that would give them pause. Information always tries to avoid letting its officers get too close to their jobs. That's why Amran, the field lead here, is Somali instead of Fur or Berry or anything else from this region. "Besides," Minja goes on, "it wouldn't go over so well if everyone on this mission looked more like me or Maria than like you and Charles." Maria, chatting with Charles a few paces ahead of them, has already turned ruddy with the sun, giving her narrow, slightly puffy face a chafed look. She has a translucent blue scarf pulled loosely over her light brown hair, though Amran told them that foreigners don't need to cover their heads. The public information that Roz sees projected next to her face gives her hometown as 5370293. It's unusual to identify from where you're from with sentinel number instead of municipal name. Roz wonders if it's because she comes from an impossibly rural place that no one has ever heard of, or if she is demonstrating some extreme commitment to the election system. Roz skips the mapping exercise of finding out exactly where 5370293 is and checks with her translator instead. Maria has been speaking Swedish. The road leaves the residential compound behind and enters rows of tents and shacks, a market zone. Roz has her information configured to keep a small map at the bottom right of her vision, available for quick enlargement, but in the market she is also offered glowing signposts projected against her vision. Iron workers down this road to the left, hand pump to the right, pottery and baskets beyond it. The flies and her nose tell her before the projections do when they approach the butcher's section, much worse than the guano back at the compound. The restaurant section is after that, which is probably logistically convenient, but a bit too much for Roz's appetite. Minja, on the other hand, sniffs hungrily at the aroma of roasting meat. "Look at that." He points with his chin at a hefty haunch of geep turning on a spit, the juices dripping into the fire pit. "We're coming back here after the meeting." "They may have planned a meal for us," Roz points out, amused. "All right, later tonight then. Best way to get to know a sentinel is to have tea in the market." Roz is about to murmur an agreement when she is distracted by something black and gleaming in the thicket of people moving along a cross street. She turns her head to look, and among the cloth of many colors, the baskets riding high on women's heads, and the glare of the sun, she sees it again. Black and shiny, and in the shape of an automatic rifle. The man holding it is wearing olive drab and moving away from her. A second later, he is completely blocked from view by other bodies. Roz slips a hand into her satchel and activates the small personal lumper she carries with her. Its range should just about reach the man with the gun, rendering the firearm inoperable if it wasn't already. It's hard to imagine that this place hasn't been thoroughly lumbered over the past few years, and Roz supposes that properly lumbered, harmless firearms may have kept some talismanic or status value here, where they held sway for so long. Probably what she saw is exactly that. Which ought to put her mind at ease. But something about the gleam of light on the surface didn't look quite right. What if the gun isn't metal? Is it possible that the Darfur government or some of its lower-level officials countenance overt display of plastic weapons? It seems unlikely. Information, which has just identified the head of the market committee, sitting among his plastic wares with a couple of other men, has nothing to say on the subject, which makes it almost certain it isn't happening. While she is craning her head after what is either a lethal weapon or a harmless anachronism, the rest of the procession bunches up in front of her. They have come up against a long, low wall running along the edge of the market and painted with an extended graphic news strip, each panel roughly the size of a market stall. How brilliant, laughs Maria. Roz squeezes into a place where she can read the section in front of them. The first panel portrays the mighty V's, Vera Kubugli and Vina Rasmussen, the co-heads of state for the supermajority government, policy first. Bas-relief headshots have been printed out and stuck above hand-painted bodies with a shared word bubble. Corporations and the corporate governments they sponsor are separate, it says, as Roz reads through her visual translator. Information agrees in a projected footnote that this is true and offers citations for the legal basis. Corporations should no longer be able to use their profits for corporate government election campaigns. A separate bubble at the bottom editorializes. Maybe they could use them to pay employees a little more instead. The next box shows Adaku Achike, the regional representative of 888, and Thaddeus Legresis, a spokesperson for Philip Morris, rebutting with their own arguments about free speech, intertwined interests, and private property. The cartoonist has added a cigarette dangling from Thaddeus's mouth, even though he never smokes in public. The third panel is a cartoon of the information building in Khartoum, which has a recognizable domed shape and is probably a familiar metonymic for the readers, with a hefty bit of text explaining the current statute and the timetable for reviewing the case. Information, as usual, attracts wordiness and boring illustrations. That doesn't hold for the final panel, which is an exaggerated caricature of Vera Kubugli attempting to hunt a boa constrictor with a falcon. The raptor, labeled information along its tail feathers, is too busy leaping through a huge tome. In the meantime, the boa, a distension of the shape of Africa in its middle, has wound the end of its tail around the leg of the mighty V. Pointed almost over the top, but wobbling just this side of a libel. Glancing down the wall, Roz sees that the next strip is an update on the legal processes against Heritage, the former supermajority, and beyond that is a series of panels on a recent social capital permit scheme. Strictly speaking, the cartoons are superfluous. All of this data is available on information to everyone. Functionally illiterate people can have their news read to them on information, and accessibility for different levels of education has been a major objective, so there are options for varying degrees of language comprehension. But someone, information tells Roz it was the town council of sheikhs, thinks literacy is important, and the public comic strip seems to be getting people to read. There are a number of locals meandering up and down, taking it in, and farther along Roz sees what looks like a cafe set up so the customers can enjoy the view while they sip their glass cups of tea. The meeting area is on the other side of the wall, about half a kilometer outside of town. There is only one species of shrub visible and very little else, so Roz has plenty of time to find out from information that the reason for the remoteness is the traditional need for a landing strip for fixed-wing aircraft or helicopters. Even the more versatile modes of transportation tend to disembark at the same spot, at least on formal occasions. As they draw closer, she can see that a small stage has been arranged at one end of the dusty field, thankfully with a woven reed roof tilted overhead. A small delegation is waiting for them. 3 men in flowing white robes, 2 with white turbans on top and the other wearing a cap, and 3 women in equally flowing but much more colorful attire. Roz is glad they kept the SWAT team down to 4. After including Amran, they are still fewer than the Sentinel government group. During the round of greetings, Roz keeps a close watch on Amran and Minja. Clasping of hands, long repetitions of similar phrases, and the occasional questions rendered meaningless by the lack of any follow-up or answer. Welcome, God be with you, praise God, good to see you, and your family, in God's name. Are you well? God is merciful, God is great. She follows the pattern as well as she can. When the flurry of introductions has settled, and Amran has reported that the governor is only a few minutes out, Roz finds herself standing beside the deputy governor, the highest-ranking official present. It's not an accident. The information bureaucracy downplays its hierarchy, but Roz is the team leader, and everyone here knows it. The deputy governor is younger than she might have expected, but Al-Jabali is young and charismatic too, so maybe this is part of their brand. Roz has already forgotten all the names she just learned, but his public information displays a graceful sweep of calligraphy beside his head. Her visual translator lets her appreciate it for a few seconds before resolving it into the Roman alphabet. Suleiman. Your first visit to this area? He asks when her eyes shift from the display to meet his. Yes, Roz says, and tries to think of something complimentary she can say about what she's seen over the past few hours. She's sure some people think of this place as beautiful, but deserts are not her idea of paradise. Very different from where you are from, perhaps. Roz catches a knowing amusement in his eyes and laughs. She's still thinking Diplo-speak, though, and asks a question rather than answering directly. Do you get a lot of visitors? We got very many in the time before the elections, the sheikh says. Of course they did. The Eastern Sahel was one of the last entrants to micro-democracy before the vote, They must have been flooded with technicians, activists, campaigners. And afterwards some, I believe they called themselves adventure tourists. They came to feel afraid here, where we live. He opens his hand, turns it up towards the sky in mystification. Hard to understand, but recently that has dropped off. I see. Roz can't imagine coming here on purpose without getting paid for it. Even if feeling afraid is your thing, there must be more thrilling places to do it, not to mention cooler. And what are you here to do? Roz looks at him in surprise. We were asked to support your new government in relations with neighboring sentinels. Her words trail off and her face starts to heat. The Sheikh's expression hasn't changed, but somehow she knows that he's not asking about the official job description. Of course he knows why they're here, and if he didn't, he wouldn't be admitting it. You are checking up on us? Policing us? The question is hostile, but his tone is level, courteous even, and the warmth in his expression has not changed. We're here to provide support, Roz repeats. You can request for us to leave if you don't want us here. This man really is extraordinarily attractive. His very dark skin is smooth and almost luminous, his features rounded and even. Roz is sure he knows that information can overrule a request for a SWAT team to exit a sentinel. Of course we won't ask you to leave, you are our guests. But we like to know what our guests are looking for here, so we can be sure they're satisfied. Very hospitable, Roz says, trying to keep it as smooth as his comment. The sheikh offers a small bow, and she thinks she sees a smile on his lips. The sun is still beating down on them. Roz glances at the horizon, hoping for some sign of the governor's transport. She sees nothing but sand, scrubs, and, over her right shoulder, Charles's face squinting into the distance. Imagine him making us wait out here, Charles mutters when she meets his eyes. She tries to imagine Al-Jabali, young, new at this, surrounded by rivals and enemies even more than most politicians. He chose to become a sentinel governor as well as head of state, so he's ambitious. And yet the fact that he's not here attending to them suggests that he's opposed to information and confident enough to show it. Or maybe he's just not very good at this part of his job, Roz thinks. Maybe schedules get away from him. Maybe he's not anti-information per se, but trying to assert his independence. She glances at Amran, thinking they'll need a much more thorough rundown of local politics. The governor is very sorry to be late, Suleiman says on her left. Roz is almost certain he can't have heard Charles's comments unless he's using something to augment his hearing. He will want to tell you himself, but there's still much work to do in our sentinels. We had very little budget or autonomy before independence, and we are trying our level best to make up for lost time. Roz smiles and nods. Rare for a politician to admit weakness like that. Whatever they're hiding must be even more embarrassing than getting up to speed on basic governance. A minor insurgency? Some looming political crisis? She becomes aware of the faintest of hums against her eardrum, at first more a sensation than a sound. As it grows into a buzz, the people around her shift, turning their gaze south, and a moment later, Roz makes out a dark smudge against the undifferentiated beige of the distance. He hopes your visit can be helpful in a number of ways, the deputy goes on. We also hope so, Roz answers. After a pause, she asks, Are you from this sentinel? Yes, Suleiman says. I was born here, and my parents never fled to Chad. Except for from some small trips within the region, I've lived in Cass my whole life. Roz wonders what that must be like. She's lived abroad since university, and she can never go home. Thinking of that, and because the deputy has turned his attention to the approaching vehicles, she glances down and taps out a message to her parents. Arrived safe. Interesting place. It looks like what the rest of the world thinks of Africa. They'll find that amusing. Talk soon. She sends it and looks up again, hoping that wasn't too obvious. Suleiman either didn't notice or is politely ignoring her inattention. She follows his gaze into the emptiness of the landscape. Roz thought she had gotten used to the desert from living in Doha, but this is different. There's no city to hold it off. This land feels unfinished and in between, scrubby semi-aridity that has been pushing closer to absolute desert over the past century. Look at that, Charles murmurs. The smudge has gotten closer, and Roz can make out the tight formation of 3 tsubames. White cloth streams out behind each 2-person craft, as if they were wearing the traditional jalabias. He clicks his tongue. Why do these African leaders always have to make such a big deal of themselves? And why do we fall for it? Oh, right, Roz says, glancing over at him. European princelings never do pomp and circumstance. Because she is turned toward him, she misses the moment of the explosion. She sees the shock on his face at the same time as she hears the bang, louder than she would have thought possible, and a clattering smash that sounds like it will never end, so rushed and unstoppable that she jumps away from it, raising her arms as though the wreckage is about to crush her, instead of smashing into the sand half a kilometer away. Through the explosion she hears, or feels, the abbreviated gasp from the man standing next to her, like a shout cut off by breathlessness. It must all be unvid, Roz thinks, as her head turns towards the sound. Even out here, they must have been a feed trained on that. She'll be able to see the explosion in detail and in slow motion as often as she wants. Probably many, many more times than she wants. Her eyes focus on the flicker of flame overhung by a spiraling column of dark smoke. There's definitely a feed on this receiving stand, so she'll be able to check reactions. Unable to stop herself, though she knows she's about to be too late again, she swings her head back to the deputy governor, automatically her first suspect. His face shows shock, or a good imitation. Mouth slightly open, eyes wild. Then he is down off the platform and plunging across the sand toward the scene of the crash. Roz leaps after him. Thank you. So I'll just talk a little bit about this book in relation to Infomocracy. When we first talked about doing a sequel to Infomocracy, I became very interested in it because, as those of you who know, and I hope most of you have read it and I'm not spoiling anything, Infomocracy is about an election. It's about an election set in this micro-democratic world that I put into the future. And it's very fast-paced, and the characters are constantly putting out fires and reacting to sabotage and doing all sorts of other things involved in campaigning. And so I wanted to really explore what this world would look like in a situation that was not all about an election campaign, and that had more to do with the governance, the day-to-day governance that we would need any political system to focus on and to function in. And as I started writing about that, I also became interested in the parts of the world that are not completely covered by information, this massive global bureaucracy that handles all sorts of data management. So, as you heard from this first chapter, there's a large part of the book is set in Darfur, which is technically part of microdemocracy at this point in history or future, but which is not as well covered as we're used to from the first book, which is lacking because of lack of density and also because of the recent time frame in which it joined. It's lacking in a lot of the surveillance capacity that we found in the first book. And a lot of the rest of the book is set in either null states or the edges of the null states, those being the nation states that remain that have not joined microdemocracy and are not covered in any way by information. And so a lot of this book is about the way in which those places that are outside of the global system impact what goes on within it. And so because of that, a lot of the book is about margins, about outsiders, about things that do not fall under the global system and the laws that we've set up. And so I do want to mention, if you're familiar with Infomocracy, you probably know that I donate part of my profits from that to the Accountability Lab, which is an organization that works on governance. For null states, I'm donating to the Institute for Statelessness and Inclusion, which works on stateless people, promoting inclusion, advocating on their behalf, and working eventually to end statelessness. So that's the theme of the book, we could say, is about the margins. And I'll be happy to take any questions now that you have. Go ahead, I know you have some. I know they're out there. Yes?
So when you were writing Infomocracy, were you writing with a sequel in mind? How much of this world did you sketch out before you started really exploring it?
Yeah, I actually had no plans of doing a sequel, and so it was largely due to the person next to you who suggested that I do one. And I was initially kind of skeptical of the idea. But as I said, when I started thinking about how much left there was in this world to explore, and particularly that other side that's not an election campaign, I really wanted to go ahead and write about that. And when I finished this one, I discovered that there was actually another book left in it, so there'll be another one coming out next year. Yes?
Being a projective novel, there's a lot of vocabulary that you have to get used to as you start reading it. Can you explain to us what a sentinel is and some of the other things that are key to the novel?
Sure, yes, sorry. I was kind of assuming that a lot of the people who came today would have read Infomocracy, so I didn't explain too much before I started. But so Infomocracy is the setting of microdemocracy. This is a system about 50 to 60 years in the future when these books take place, in which the nation state is mostly but not entirely dead. As I mentioned before, the remaining nation states are the null states of the title of this book. And instead of that, what we have are a basic political unit of 100,000 people called a sentinel. So it's defined by population rather than geography, which means it could be a couple of very dense city blocks around here, perhaps, or it could be a very large rural area. And those 100,000 people, that group, can choose any government that they want out of the roughly 2,000 governments available in the world. So someone in Manhattan and 999,000 of their closest friends could choose to vote to live in a system that is like the system that is today, for example, in Norway. Or they could choose a system that reflects the values and processes and tax structures and laws of a Puerto Rican diaspora. Or they could choose a system that is all about big government and social welfare. They could choose a system that's all about small government and individual responsibility. They could choose a system that's all about cute Japanese characters and cosplay. There's a government like that. And so there's this wide variety of governments. As long as you can get enough of your friends to go along with you, you can have any one of them that you want. And so governments also have a vast and often very dispersed constituency. And holding all of this together is information, which is a global bureaucracy that's sort of a cross between the UN and Google. And fun fact, part of the reason I came up with this is that working in disasters, the UN doesn't always have the greatest reputation among NGO workers. You know, you could say there's a little bit of competitiveness there, but also just a lot of the problems of a large bureaucracy trying to respond quickly. One thing that they are actually very good at in disasters is information management. And I would just like them to do that all the time. So that's part of where information comes from in the book. Yes?
Have any sort of current events influenced your writing in this book, I guess, over the course of writing this book in the last year or so?
Yes. There were, I think what was almost harder than that was when I wrote things and then current events happened about them. And it was very depressing that the book hadn't come out yet and nobody knew that I actually came up with them first.
Malka, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sorry. So the question was whether there were current events that had happened over the past year that had affected my writing of the book. Or changed.
Things.
Yeah, so there were things that I wrote and then things happened, like Brexit, and I was like, I wrote that first, I wish the book was out already. So there was a little bit of that. I was also trying very consciously not to get too caught up in things that were happening day to day. There were so many of them, and there were so many things that were related to the themes I was writing about that it was very tempting to really rip things from the headlines. But knowing the publishing timeline and knowing how fast things are changing now in the real world as well, I was trying to really stick with the things that I extrapolate from a decade or so of really watching politics and international relations, plus the things that I could build off of from the first book that I felt like made sense from what happened in the first book and the characters that I had from there, and not get too caught up in trying to jump on anything immediate because it would have been long gone by the time this book came out. So, but it's a good question, and it has been tricky because there has been so much going on in the realm of what I'm talking about that it was very hard to avoid the temptation. Any other questions?
So, one question.
Yes.
So you're really busy. How do you find time to pick out novels?
Well, I have some help with parts of the busyness. And also, I'm a PhD student, and honestly, my thesis has suffered terribly over the past 3 years. And I haven't told my thesis advisor about the third book yet. And it's done, I mean, except for edits, but I wrote it all and kind of didn't tell him, so he doesn't, I think he's not on Twitter, so I'm hopeful that it works. So part of it is having kind of a flexible, I worked for many years and I have been doing consulting, which helps, but I have a very flexible job in the PhD, which has been useful for the books and less so for the PhD. Yes?
Yeah, you have a very fluid, nice writing style, and very smart. When you get past all of the vocabulary, it's like a page turner, definitely. So what inspires your writing? Where does your writing style have its roots in?
I read very, very widely, so I would be hard pressed to pick one particular influence. But for these books in particular, I will say that I think Neil Stephenson is a huge influence, William Gibson as well. I think the present tense that I use in these books comes in large part from Snow Crash. And I was thinking a lot about cyberpunk as a genre when I started writing the first book. And it starts in Japan, and it has kind of that cyberpunk feel to it. And I think that changed a little as I went on and got more into the book, but it was a great way for me to sort of start and kick it off with the mood.
Yeah, the earthquake is a great page turner section.
Yes.
How do you deal with the problem of future shock? I think a lot of science fiction writers are they're afraid of putting their setting in the future because of becoming outdated, everything happening so rapidly. So how do you sort of thread the needle, and how do you deal with the problem of like information overload? Like not just currently with your own personal life, but even in novels, there's a lot of information available. So I would imagine the characters have their own ways of filtering it, and there might be like hardware involved, or there might be like some kind of a cultural adaptation.
Sure. Okay, so I think there were two questions there. One was about the question.
Sorry, I sneaked one.
Yeah, it's okay. One was about future shock and kind of the worry of writing things into the future that then, as we get into the future, turn out not to be true. And so part of the answer to that is that I set this 50 to 60 years in the future to give myself some time. And the system, even at this point, is about 22 years old, so I still have a little time. And part of the answer is that I just made the decision that I wasn't going to care about it. That I was really writing in these books about the present. I used the future to talk about the present, and I think I have some experience in geopolitics. I have some experience in international relations and a little economics background, sort of, and these things. So I could think into the future in those ways. But I'm not an engineer. I'm not really a techie. So I just decided I'm going to write some stuff that helps me tell the story I want to tell. And it's not going to come true, and that's fine. And if any of it inspires people to create some of the gadgets that I talk about, I hope that they will give me, some royalties, and that would be nice. But otherwise, I'm just not going to worry about it, because I'm trying to make points about things that are going on now, and now actually helped me out a lot with that by making those points very emphatically right after my book was published. So that kind of took care of itself. Then the other question you had was about the amount of information that the people in the books are dealing with, and how they handle that, and if there's hardware for that, or if it's just cultural. And I think it's both. We have obviously adjusted to inputting a lot more information than even we ourselves did a couple of years back, let alone our near ancestors. And our kids are going to be inputting even more, and probably already do. So I think there's been a cultural adjustment in the books. There's also mention of filters at the very beginning of book 3. So there are some hardware, software elements that you can use to try and cut down, particularly in very high information density environments, what you get. I think I didn't end up putting it in the text, but I originally called it a TMI filter, and then I decided that was like a little too much. Any other questions? Feel free, no question is too silly.
Not really a question, but I want to give credit to your pink flamingo there.
Yes.
Very well.
The pink flamingo always steals the show. Yes.
Can I ask, in the world you envision, what is the silliest government exists? I know there's, you mentioned ones based around cosplay. Do you have ones that are really out there that are favorites of yours?
No, I don't want to say cosplay is silly.
No.
And that government does reputably have like a pretty good economic base with what they work with. I think Hello Kitty is involved heavily. Sanrio is in there. But it is mentioned in the first book. They don't do well with disaster response. That's just not their focus. There is a government mentioned in the second book that is called USA, and no one can figure out if it's ironic or if they really think the United States is that great, and they're mostly based in Europe, Eastern Europe, and a couple of other places, and I think they drink a lot out of the red Solo cups, and that's like their thing. But also, actually, to be a little more serious about the answer to that question, there's another government which is quite a lot larger, which is called Starlight, and is based entirely around celebrity. And that is pretty silly, and it's also not that far off the truth. So, yeah.
Well, I guess to say to follow up on that question, which government would you choose if you could vote?
That's a great question. I think, in the first book, there's a government called Policy First, which is based around the idea of policies and voting on that instead of on celebrity or nationalism or something else. So that's a kind of the easy answer. I think there are a lot of times when I would go with one of the environmentally based governments instead. Policy First has a tendency to kind of trip over its own shoelaces and get a little stuck. And I sometimes think I just want one of the local governments that kind of does great work in a couple of sentinels and tries to ensure a good quality of life and doesn't worry about global world peace or having the absolute best policies for everywhere in the world. And sometimes I think that's the way to go, and we should all just concentrate on our local governments and try to build great towns and villages and cities and neighborhoods. Yeah.
So not really about the book, but is there a part of your writing that you think gets more praise than it deserves, and a part at the other side that gets less?
I'll always take more. I mean,
is there a part that's overlooked?
I don't know. I mean, one thing that was very interesting to me in this whole experience has been that a lot of reviews disagreed on different things that they liked or didn't like. Like I had some reviews that said, the action is great, but the characters are flat. And then I had other reviews that said, I love the characters, they're so warm and three-dimensional. And but the book got a little bogged down in the beginning and info dumps. And so there, there's actually been a real variety of impressions that people got from it. And that's kind of nice as a writer because I can pick and choose and just decide that the ones who like stuff are right. Anything else? Otherwise, very happy to sign books for people and answer questions that you didn't want to ask in front of everybody or that you think of later. And I want to thank you all so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Malka.